Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Last day of 1975. Papa Ram Dass.
So first let me introduce myself once again. My name is Ram Dass, which means, Das means servant, and Ram is one of the names of God, of that which is nameless. Prior to being Ram Dass, I was Richard Alpert, PhD in psychology. I taught at Stanford, Cal, and for 5 years I was assistant professor at Harvard University. My research took me into consciousness-altering and mind-expanding chemicals in 1961 with Tim Leary, and we did quite a bit of work together from 1961 to 1965. That work led to my dismissal from Harvard because that was such controversial research. We were working with a chemical called psilocybin, which is from the psilocybe mushroom, which in Mexico is called tiananactl, or flesh of the gods, and is used by curanderos, medicine men, as a vehicle for oracular powers and also for healing and for mystic experience. And what we found was that through these chemicals we were able to delve into realms of human consciousness and states of awareness that were not available to us in our normal waking consciousness. And we worked with people like Aldous Huxley and Gerald Hurd and physicists and artists and musicians and prisoners and doctors, psychiatrists and students, and generally trying not to impose too strong a model on how these chemicals should be used, but rather trying to keep open to what they might teach us if we could keep open long enough, because prior to this time these chemicals had been treated in this society as psychotomimetic. And as I said, prior to this time these chemicals were used as psychotomimetics, that is, they were used to induce states which were considered to be psychotic or mental aberrations by the psychiatry researchers, psychiatric researchers. And this was the first time that these chemicals were being considered in relation to their religious, philosophical, and spiritual significance. Right? Unfortunately, the research was very volatile and raised a number of very frightening issues for the society, especially since many people were interested in experimenting with their own consciousness, and there was quite a bit of question as to who had the right to do this. Of course, the medical profession said they had the only right to do it, and this was disputed very strongly. And when the government and the medical profession made it, as a result of things like Ken Kesey's acid tests and things like that, made it illegal for others to use these chemicals, the whole thing went underground. And people as eminent as Aldous Huxley and others we were all sharing the same underground sources of these materials, not out of the fact that we were junkies or self-destructive or trying to hurt society, but we felt that any new pseudopod in knowledge in a society is always treated initially as deviant, and we had to be true to our own intuition about the value of these things. Well, whether it was the personality structures of the people involved or whether it was the timing or whatever it was, our research was too volatile, and finally it was discontinued. And we went on, we left Harvard, we went to Mexico as IFIF, International Federation for Internal Freedom. Then we got thrown out of there, we went to the Caribbean, we got thrown out of there, we ended up in Millbrook, New York, on an estate owned by the Mellon family. And for some years we had Castalia Foundation, which some of you will recognize coming out of a mystic religious order and used by Hermann Hesse also. And we did research there. Ultimately, I left that, and then it was closed down finally, and Tim had a number of legal issues as a result of his work there. I went off and became a lecturer on the topic and worked, interestingly enough, for the United States Office of Education and the Drug Abuse Control Division, along with working in the underground. And I lived quite a double agent life for some years. In 1966 or 7, I had already been very involved in the Haight-Ashbury and the way in which the psychedelics were affecting the culture through the rock and roll, the San Francisco Sound in those days, the Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead and people like that. And I worked closely with a fellow by the name of Owsley Stanley, who was involved with LSD at the time. In 67, I went to India, and mainly because every map we had ever come up with that was written about what we were experimenting with had primarily come out of originally the same source, whether it had come through the Kabbalah, Hasidic tradition, or whether it had come through Christian mysticism. If you traced it back through the Chinese Tao, you got back into the East, and primarily into the Indus Valley, into a place in all up through the Himalayas and northern India and Afghanistan and all through there. So I went with a friend in a Land Rover looking for whirling dervishes in Afghanistan and Iran, and looking for Indian mystics, and we ended up in Nepal at temples in Nepal and Kathmandu. After that, I met a young American who seemed to know a great deal more about what I was trying to find out about than I did, and I stayed with him in India for several months. He ultimately brought me to a man up in the Himalayas who, within a very few minutes, showed me that he knew everything that I thought, everything that I was in the past, although there was no way that he could know that. And in addition, as I got to know him, I began to realize that he represented what it was that I was trying to achieve through psychedelics. That with psychedelics I kept going up and coming down, while he was a statement of the thing itself. And I started to yearn to become what it was that I was touching and exploring, rather than to always be an explorer of it. It's like always taking trips to Los Angeles and yearning to settle there, and then finally going out and just settling there, and wanting to live and settle down and be in that space. And once I had found a real one who wasn't dependent either on somebody else or on anything, it appeared, he just was the statement. He was that statement all the time. I started to yearn for that, and I stayed with him. That was in 67, November. And he's been my spiritual guide ever since. I stayed with him until 68, came back to America. He sent me back, and I taught for a few years. Again went back to India for more teaching, stayed from 70 to 72, came back, again started to teach here. In September 73, he left his body, which shook me up somewhat, because I still felt very dependent upon him as my vehicle for growth. I continued on feeling that though he had left his body, I knew enough about reincarnation and who he was to realize that though he had dropped his body, he was still around, although I didn't experience him, but I felt that he was guiding me, because he had assured me he would always guide me. So I kept going along, assuming that everything I would do would be blessed and protected by him. But as time went on, again, I started to lose the thread a little bit. I started to become responding to the pressures of the Western society, and who have a strong need for a teacher and a wise man. And I found myself getting caught in being wiser than I was, if you will. And around August of '74, in somewhat of a state of despair, I decided to stop teaching and return to India. At that moment, no, puss, don't do that. I met a teacher here in New York. She has no claws, so it's okay. At that time, I met a teacher here in New York who awakened me out of that stagnant state, and has been, I've felt in the past year and a half, an incredible amount of growth in terms of my own purity, clarity, understanding, connection to God, and connection to my own Guru. And I think that I work very intuitively, in the sense that if I feel that a teaching is bringing me closer to God, I go. And the minute I feel it isn't, I will walk away from it. And I have walked away. I've taken many beautiful teachings from many, many traditions, from Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish. There are many teachings available in America at the moment. And these teachings do not have to be judged as good or bad. Each individual merely has to judge, this teaching is relevant for me at this moment. You don't have to decide it's a bad teaching. It just doesn't have any relevance to me at this moment. In America at the moment, there is a very impressive thirst for inner growth, or for inner meaning, or for inner calm or peace or deepening. At the root of it is a desire for a meaning to existence. For we are in the peculiar position of being so affluent and so visible to ourselves through the media of television, that we are in the peculiar position in the history of the world that we see the limits of all of our games, which makes us despairing and available. We're available to new input of information, rather than living in the fantasies which, were we to spend a lifetime living them out, would lead us ultimately to realize their limitations. But now we see through them. And I'm always impressed that a child, by the time he's 12 years old, can have lived out literally hundreds of adult roles through vicarious involvement of television, and makes that being at 13 years old, in a funny way, burned out of the kind of idealism or linear projection of his life that was available to somebody that lived in a small town in the past that wanted to become something, this or that. So, and this has, of course, profoundly affected higher education, for there's much more question now of the meaning of higher education. There's a very real question of the value of advanced education, as opposed to people getting direct experience of life, for example. I mean, there's been a really opening to questions about the cultural models that we've been functioning under. For a long time, in America anyway, we were a frontier mentality. We were people who had come to America and pushed westward, and we were always pushing, and we now have pushed to the moon. And by always hiding in our external achievements. But then when you see that, so you get to the moon, and then so what? I remember my guru saying to me, I hear you're going to the moon. And then, I mean, he was kidding me about being a Westerner. Here you're going to the moon, and then he just giggled. As if, is that a big deal, you know? And that might sound like sour grapes from a man from India, where it's a culture that's rotting on the vine economically. But to understand the nature of the universe he lived in made man's worldly ventures quite different in perspective. I mean, his perspective about them was entirely different than for what would it be for most of us. Which raises the question of what is the value of all this altered consciousness and higher consciousness and spiritual liberation, and what does it get man? Where does it get us? Well, if you ask the question from the point of view of, from the world point of view, it's a tough one. Because does it bring heaven on earth? Not necessarily. What it may bring is the compassion that has within it the wisdom of why earth is earth and not heaven, and thus not the longing that it should be other than it is. That is, working with what is rather than trying to, than the discomfort that comes from always living in what could be. At the same moment, there's a paradox here. This is a very profound paradox. The paradox is that the more planes of consciousness you enter into, and the less you are attached to any particular plane, including the physical plane in which the world exists, the more you become awed by the, you could say, the perfection of the mind of God, or you could say the divine plan, or the exquisiteness of the articulation of the universe, or the things like synchronicity of events, or total interrelatedness of every atom within the universe, lawfully, not rationally lawfully, not logically lawfully, but naturally lawfully, in the same way that the Tao is a naturally lawful instrument. And at the same moment, seeing the perfection of this, at the same moment, you still retain your involvement in your incarnation on this earth, and you become much more aware of the incredible amount of suffering that exists in beings that are lost in the illusion of time and space. Now, I use that word lost in the illusion of time and space because as you alter your consciousness, you enter into a state of a space within yourself, a frame of reference within yourself, a point of awareness within yourself, which has nothing to do with time and space. Now that immediately smacks of eternality, but even the concept of eternal is time, and this is even beyond that. So what I am really saying is just what every Eastern philosophy, except, well, has said on partway home, which is saying that God is within each individual, that which is beyond time and beyond space exists within you. And when you go in deep enough, you become identified. It's as if you have, the image I always like is the one of the television channels. That's such a powerful image, you know. You look at another human being with one channel. Say you're on channel 7. You look at another human being and you see their body and you see their sexual identity and you see man and woman and you see strong or weak or fat or thin or old or young. You flip the dial once and you look at another person and you see their psychological makeup. Happy, sad, depressed, manic depressive, courageous, somebody looking into the future, idealist, etc. That would be a reality, a plane of reality. You flip the dial one more channel and you see everybody as Leo or Aries or Sagittarius or Libra. You see everybody in terms of their astral identity. You flip the television channel once more And when you look into somebody's eyes, you see another being just like you, still separate, but just like you, looking back at you. Like, are you in there? I'm in here, far out, here we are. And at that point, all of the body, personality, astral identity is all packaging. And there's this being just like you inside a different package than you're in. Okay? That's soul. That's what we call soul in Western Christianity, for example. Okay? Now, if you go one more flick of the dial, you come to the point where when you look in the eyes of another person, it's like two mirrors facing each other with nothing in between. It's itself looking at itself, looking at itself, looking at itself, because within the separate souls is that which is common to all. That is the mystic experience. That's the experience where you've come into the one, where you say the universe is one. We are one consciousness. You have now entered into the oneness. You've gone beyond the multiplicity and into the one. As long as I must add the final flip of the dial just to make the whole picture complete. If you flip the dial once more, then you disappear and the dial disappears and it all disappears because you have gone beyond form. You've gone into the formless. That is, you've gone beyond seeing the one, you've gone into the one, and in the one is the zero. There is nothing within the one. In other words, the whole universe of form rests on formlessness. It is as if out of nothing comes everything. But everything is merely an illusion based on nothingness. I mean, this is the most profound kind of wisdom, the paradox that form and formless are the same thing. They're just looked at from different angles, or they are experienced in different ways. So that as you change your level of consciousness and come into higher planes, you come into, like when you go into the soul, you are no longer, the essence of the soul is not in time. It goes through, it passes through time, but it itself is timeless. Because it is part of that which has no time, which has no beginning and no end. And in that sense, in each individual is something which is not born and which does not die. Now, the minute you have touched that in yourself, the fear of death, the meaning of a life experience is immediately changed very profoundly. At first, you don't know how to deal with this new thing that's happened to you because all your habits of seeing the universe are based on how you used to think it was. But it's as if the rug has been pulled out from under your whole conceptual universe, the whole way you think about everything. Now you're left with this new experience that you aren't who you thought you were, and thus the universe isn't what you thought it was, because you built the whole universe around who you thought you were. And then very slowly you start to put the pieces back together again in an intuitive harmony with what you now sense the universe to be. Right? And at first you attempt to find new conceptual models, new thinking models to explain it away. Later you give that up a little bit and you just become very simple. And you just are sitting in, you're sitting in time and space, but you are not of time and space. Like you are in the world, but not of the world. It's that same image. And then whatever is called upon for you to do, be it on the physical plane, astral plane, whatever plane, you're there. And since you're not in time and space, you can be in lots of places simultaneously. I mean, it gets very far out when you start to play in these realms of consciousness. So now, I come back to the question of what is the relevance for mankind? Well, for you to be free of fear of death and for you to be free of the anxiety about life, because that changes the way in which you are attached or lost in your melodrama. Because from my point of view, my entire life must be lived beautifully, exquisitely, consciously, and with great awareness of the implications of every act in every level of reality, including in God, as well as with man. An act has to be true across all planes of existence for it to be totally true. It can be, as we've learned, an act can be true on one level and a lie at another. But for an act to be true at every level and in harmony with all the forces in the level, you can't think your way into that situation because it's too complex a factor analytic problem. Your mind couldn't handle it. You can only become like a tree bends with the wind. It flows in the harmony of the universe. You become simple in that sense. It is a whole higher level of knowing, sensing, than the five senses in the thinking mind. It's what Gurdjieff called the higher faculty. It's what it's the mystic realm of thought. It's now what this realm does is give an individual the opportunity to see the implications of his or her acts, free of the distortions that are the result of attachments, which come out of fear. Once the fear is gone, then there is no clinging. And Buddha said the secret of the game is the end of clinging. His Four Noble Truths, when he came out from under the Bodhi tree, he said, he looks around, he says, any attachment to form is suffering, the suffering, because it's going to change or end. Same thing Christ said when he said, lay not up your treasures where moth and rust doth corrupt. And then Buddha said, the cause of suffering is clinging to this or that. And then he said, the way you end suffering is to give up attachment or clinging. Now that doesn't mean you give up involvement. If you're married, you don't walk away from your family. You become a perfect wife or a perfect husband. But you're not lost in it. You are just like whatever clothing you're wearing at the moment. You keep it clean and neat. But you don't identify yourself with it. You aren't your red sweater. You're just using the red sweater. Well, in the same way you use all your social roles. You use your car, and you use your personality. It's all there, but who are you? You aren't any of those things. You sit behind, within it. Not superior, not, because that's another psychological game. This isn't dissociation. This isn't, look how good I am. You're right in the middle of the stew. You're in every moment totally, but there's nothing that catches you. It's like there's nothing that can hook on to you inside. It's like if you have a model of who you think you are and somebody comes up and tells you something which disconfirms it. Like you think you're handsome and somebody comes up and says, God, you're ugly. Your first reaction is to that statement in view of what you thought. If you don't have a model of who you are and they say that, you just see that as an interesting statement that was made because you don't have to hang it on anything since you don't have to have a model of who you are. See, the one thing that's in the West, we always think we have to have opinions and attitudes about everything. But it turns out you don't have to. You can have them if you need to have them. I mean, I can have opinions about lots of things. But I can sit with a very empty mind all the time. And that, you can have opinions without being attached to the opinions. And that's kind of a distinction. Now, in terms of social action and social change, social responsibility, like when you become more conscious, do you become less of a social activist? No, not necessarily at all. You become a more conscious social activist. That is, you don't get lost in your own emotions. You become more effective because you're more capable of being conscious of what the person on the other side, quote, is experiencing. Because you are living in the realm that exists behind us and them. And so you are able to experience usness and themness, which gives you a distinct advantage in any game you decide to play. Because you are aware of the entire situation rather than merely being locked in your own emotions, in your own anger or your own frustration or your own desires. So what are the implications for the world? Well, the world has great need and use for wise men in the culture. Kings always surrounded themselves with wise men. And then that concept was lost, and we surrendered to knowledgeable people. People with very powerful rational minds. Henry Kissinger, Herman Kahn, people like this. But these people are not wise men. They almost are. I mean, a situation almost demands that a Henry Kissinger become a statesman instead of a politician, instead of a, just an intellectual. But it doesn't quite, his ego doesn't quite, the situation didn't force the transcendence of his ego sufficiently so that he became a perfect instrument of the divine will at that moment, right? And that's what a wise man is. A wise man is somebody that is merely a mirror and an articulator of the flow, which is the way of saying of the will of God, right? And such a being is at peace because such a being is in the flow of the universe in the same way that a tree is at peace or a river is at peace. And such a being, when he or she is available to somebody who is in the stream of action, a statesman or anybody, any active person, feeds into that active person a resonance with the place in them which is quiet. And the highest politician is someone who is quiet inside. It's like my guru used to say about Abe Lincoln, that he knew that Christ was the real president, that he was only acting president. And that's the key of the whole game, that he's a perfect president because he's not lost in being president. It was almost done by Jack Kennedy because he had Hyannisport and his father and his family, because he had a frame of reference that made the presidency a game. Not in the pejorative sense of game, not in a put-down, but in the sense of not getting lost in it, like Lyndon Johnson got lost in it. He got lost in his ego sense in the game. And that's a key issue, you know. And very few political activists, whether they are establishment or revolutionaries, are free of their ego involvement and getting caught in the game. So the games are less well played. What, in addition, though, in a more profound sense, what all of this stuff is about, is that it closes the ring that starts out literally, well, yes, literally, one way of looking at it literally, with the Garden of Eden. It starts out, if you visualize a clock, at 12 o'clock, with man in perfect harmony with God, with the universe. That is the will of God. It's like a perfect clock. And in that perfection is included the choice that man can make to go against the will of God. That's the one thing that's built in. The freedom to go against the harmony is part of the perfection of the game, right? And that is what man opted to do. And that's what man opted to do. The apple represents that choice to know God rather than to be God, to have the individual power of knowing. It's like dualism. It's the entrance into dualism. It's the entrance into form, if you will, because you can imagine the Garden of Eden as almost being formless. Although it's characterized as forms, it is really, there's no reproduction at that point, and there's just, it's like an angelic realm, if you will. Then man comes into a denser realm because he comes into his own mind, which is a much denser space. And he knows, and he's got separate power. From 12:01, in which that's happened, up to 6 o'clock, he's spending lifetime after lifetime after lifetime trying to capitalize on what he knows in order to recreate that perfection of heaven and still keep his own power as a separate being. He's trying to become God of the universe as a separate entity. At 6 o'clock comes the despair that he's not going to make it. He's tried everything, and in our culture, the things that you try are trying to get more and more and more of everything. That's one thing you try. Or trying to bring each thing you get closer together, the rushes closer together, so that you're eating, and in the middle of the main course you're thinking about dessert, and in the dessert you're thinking about the coffee, and the coffee you're thinking about the cigarette, and the cigarette you're thinking about the bowling, and the bowling you're thinking about the ice cream soda, and then you're thinking about the sex, and then you're thinking about what's in the refrigerator. And you're always jamming them in together for fear of having a moment when you're not working to get another rush. Okay? And life is just a series of, and if you can get them so close together, you almost don't notice the spaces between them. Okay? That was the idea that more was better, both in terms of each thing. If you had an ice cream, wouldn't it be better with fudge sauce? Wouldn't it be better with marshmallows? Wouldn't it be better with cherry? Wouldn't it be better with nuts? Wouldn't it, you know, and on and on and on. and then a banana split, and then a double banana split, and then an awful, or whatever they get, you know, the huge things. That more, and you look at people's obesity, and you get, and that kind of that's the super sensual astral trip, that more is going to be enough, but more isn't ever enough. That's the horror of it, you know. 6 o'clock, man realizes that. That despair is the prerequisite for the rest of the clock. And at 6:01 starts the next game. That's when man, in his despair, looks inward or looks upward. And he starts to recognize something deeper within himself. And that's the place we're at. In a cultural sense at this moment. I mean, like hundreds of thousands of people are at that point. There are very few at 8 o'clock, and there are fewer still at 9 o'clock, and there's maybe like 3 at 10:30, you know. I mean, in the world, you know. I mean, it gets really thin up there. But in terms of where the culture previously, a couple of hundred years ago, was at 4 o'clock, now the culture's at 6 o'clock, I mean, or at 5:30 anyway, right, with a good segment at 6, right? Now, is that image clear? So now starts the coming home. And what you're trying to do as you come back is you realize now that only when you tune in to that which is the perfection, into the flow, when you surrender your trip into the trip, not my but thy will, O Lord, are you going to get that thing you wanted in the first place. That is the feeling of the perfect orgasm, the continuous perfect orgasm, is not going to come through your mastery and control, but through your surrender. Okay? But surrender is anathema to somebody at 4 o'clock, see, because that's power. It's losing power to surrender. Depends on what you're surrendering to, whether you're surrendering into the universe or you're surrendering to another human being's mentality. We've always thought of surrender. We've always thought, see, we are coming out of a culture that is man over nature. Man's control over nature. Not recognizing that nature is the most obvious and gross manifestation of the Divine Mother, of the forms of the universe. And you're trying to master and control that of which you are a subsection. It's like the fallacy of something trying to control that out of which it comes. In logic, it's an impossibility. It's a subset trying to define the set out of which it comes. All right, it's just a logical impossibility, and it's an absurdity. It's an absurdity what man keeps trying to do. And now what happens is people after 6 o'clock flip their understanding, and they start to move into a culture that is man in nature rather than man over nature. Because man over nature has led to ecological imbalance. It's led to total paranoia. Not total, but large paranoia of distrust among human beings. Because everybody's trying to optimize the game for themselves. The game after 6 o'clock realizes you move into what in chakra terms is called the fourth chakra, which is that of compassion, or more like Christ consciousness, and you move into an awareness that for me to have what I really want, you've got to have it too. Okay? Which is the realm of brotherhood, not as an intellectual trip, but as an obvious perceptual reality. Because if I look in your eyes and I see somebody else just like me, it's very hard for me to figure out that I can screw you and get away with it, because you and I are the same being. We're just in two different forms, right? So that the whole nature of the social game starts to change with these new levels of consciousness. And that changes economics, it changes politics, it changes the entire fabric of human existence. Very slowly and very gently. But you feed in a few beings. You feed in even one being, one Buddha, or one Christ, or one such being at any time in history. And you feed in, once again, the choice, the manifestation of a real choice for human beings to see the possibility of living in God, living back in the Garden of Eden, living back in that harmony, closing the ring, coming back up to 12 o'clock, right? And what enlightened, realized beings are they beings that got up to 11:59, had the choice of either diving into 12 o'clock and giving up form completely, becoming just one with the empty, that which is God, which is beyond the concept of God, because the concept of God is still in form, but God isn't in form, right? or making a commitment, which is called the Bodhisattva Vow in Tibetan Buddhism, to stay in form in order to liberate other beings, okay? To bring that light back down. And those are gurus, they're saints, those are those beings. Whether they've done it in this lifetime or they've incarnated consciously, like a Christ does. And, I mean, to understand that the real sacrifice Christ made was not the crucifixion, but in leaving the Father in the first place to take an incarnation. That was the real sacrifice that he made. Because for such beings, to stay separate from God is an incredible sacrifice. That is becoming the lamb, the sacrificial lamb. That is what it is. You come into a gross form and live in a gross life. For no reason. You don't want any rush out of it at all, because you already have the potential of having the whole rush. It's all yours. You give it up. You give up the total, orgasmic, eternal unity in order to stay separate, just a thread of separateness, in order to be a doorway through which others can get there. Okay? And though the existence of such a being in the world, or the existence of such beings, historically or presently, keeps creating for man the possibility of that happening. The choice. It gives man another chance to make a choice to look up rather than looking down. Right? Now, sequentially, once you look up, as I said before, once you look up, you see the perfection of the universe, but if you get too enamored with that and forget your fellow man and humanity, you've blown it again, because God is everywhere. It's all the forms. So you ultimately have to look up and look down. Jesus looked down. At the same moment he said to everybody, I come it's not me you're after, because that's down, that's the sun. I come as a representative of my Father. That's the up. That's the formless. And Buddha said, don't worship me, because I'm just a guy that's teaching you. Go to nirvana, which is the Father, which is that which is beyond form. It's the same thing. And the Jews say the whole game is G-D. It's that which is unspeakable, right? It's the same place, same place. And Allah turns out to be the same thing, and you keep hitting it over and over again. And what excites me, or what the word wouldn't be excitement, but what delights me is the universality of the spirit that exists behind religious metaphors. The religions are religions, but the spirit is the spirit, and it's that kind of thing. Yeah. So, why people meditate, what they do is when they want to get hooked into this kind of a circuitry, when they start to hear this kind of stuff, they want to turn inside and they want to know how to do it. And there are many methods available for doing this kind of thing. Many large institutionalized methods like transcendental meditation and things like that. All of which will give you a basic beginning. The problem is a lot of these institutions sell short of what is possible. They've taken a possibility to allow man to transcend his mortality, and they've turned it back into mortality, saying you'll have more pleasure in life by being more meditative, which is true, but that's very much short of the mark, because pleasure isn't still going to be enough. So that it's kind of important that you that hear this message keep your own intuitive sense of what's possible going as you use methods that might be found available to you. I want to say a word about psychological stuff, because in this society there is a lot of preoccupation with neurosis, mental health, pathology, sexual hang-ups, and so on. I spent years very preoccupied and hung up with my own neurosis. I lived many years as a homosexual, as a bisexual, working through psychoanalysis, finally finding some satisfying and fulfilling sexual relationships with a woman, and then realizing finally that my psychology was merely part of the packaging. It was not the essence of my being. And that as I have entered into the essence of my being, I experience myself as neither male nor female, though I am in a man's body and capable of functioning in a man's body as a male. And that my whole personality is like my Chevrolet. It's a vehicle for me to function in the world with. It is not who I am. And I now see, and I say to you, it is time for you to extricate yourself from your own melodrama. You have been busy being Ram Dass or Elliot or Sarah or Doris or Frank or Bill long enough. That use Dorisness and frankness and Billness, but recognize that who you are is far more profound than that. And that your identity in this incarnation is but the particular drama you're living out at the moment. It's like, did you ever dream at night, and then you wake up from the dream, and then you realize you're still dreaming, and that it was a dream within a dream? Okay? Well, now, the one we're talking in at this moment is just such a thing. This is a dream. We're still in a dream. We haven't yet awakened. And when we awaken, you look and you say, just as you did this morning, you said, far out, that was a dream. And it seems so real at the time. Well, so this all seems so real. That's why it's called Maya or illusion. It is real within itself. It is relatively real, but in an absolute sense, it goes back into the nothingness from which it came. And a conscious being knows that, never forgets it, and lives with that nothingness and the somethingness at the same moment, so doesn't get lost in his or her melodrama, which is a big secret of contentment and of openness to each moment, even the moment of dying, because then you're not clinging to life. You're open to whatever each moment can hold, because there's no identification with your own history. As Castaneda says, Don Juan says, you give up your personal history, your sense of personal history. So that I would say to people who have things like sexual hang-ups, you can spend your life preoccupying yourself with that, spending time with therapists for whom their personalities are real, so that they make your personality stuff real, because they don't know how to do anything else. Or you can realize that you are a child of God and get on with it, and use the suffering that you have in this lifetime, whether it's neurosis or sexual deviation or cancer or a bad marriage or a lousy job or a short leg or a wart in the end of your nose or small genitals or no breasts or whatever it is, use it all as the fire of purification and realize that the entire life you have been given is given to help you awaken out of the illusion of your own separateness. And if you will use everything in your life as grist for that mill, the minute you say, I am a being, I am a soul awakening to my own Godhead, to my own source, then you say, what is the meaning of my life? My life exists specifically in order to help me awaken. Everybody I meet on the subway, everything that happens to me is grist for that mill. Nothing is excluded. Nothing. And then at that point, you come into the remarkable space that very few people are in this society, where suffering becomes grace, where you begin to use your own adversity to your advantage. It's like judo. At that point, nothing can get you, because it's all grist for the mill. That's Mahatma Gandhi being sent to prison, and they give him a lice-infested uniform and tell him to clean the urinals. And he says, thank you. And it's not a sarcasm, it's that he's being given stuff to work with. It's far out. The projects that interest me at the moment, the projects that interest me at the moment are the prison ashram project. I have a thing called the Hanuman Foundation. Hanuman is the servant of God, a monkey, instrument of God, part of my own lineage, spiritual lineage. And we have a prison project in which we're trying to convert prisons in America into ashrams or monasteries. And we're not trying to change the nature of the warden or the guards or anything like that. We're merely creating a reality, an alternative reality for the mind of an inmate to use the time that he is serving or she is serving in order to come to God or to become more conscious. And the image I always have is a prison block in which there are 15 prisoners and 3 guards, and the 15 prisoners all think they're in a monastery. And then the only people left in prison are the guards, because a monastery, just like a prison, provides food and clothing, gives you a cell, and keeps you segregated from society so that you don't get lost in worldly desires. So a prison is an exquisite place to do your work. You have a hot fire because you have to deal with the paranoia of all the people around you. And everybody else's model that you're in prison. But that's a good fire if you know what you're doing. So we put out a magazine called Inside Out, which is available free to any prisoner that wants it, any inmate. And anybody that wants it may contact me. And I will certainly see that they get a copy of Inside Out. We're putting out the 2nd issue in about a month. And we're also sort of trying to support and encourage all of the different projects for training prisoners in meditation, in yoga, in trying to work with their prison experience to become more conscious. The second project, a big project that I'm interested in, is the Centers for Dying, or what would be called Alternative Metaphor for Dying project. In our society, there is a somewhat of a inhumane way of treating death, where people are put in intensive care units, and everybody around them denies death and tries to keep the body alive at all costs. And the poor person that's inside is surrounded by fear and panic because nobody is ready to deal with death. And even the ministers and priests and rabbis themselves are so frightened of death, and the doctors, that everything is a denial of what is a rather imminent reality for most people in intensive care units. Our plan, the intermediate steps that have been taken, for example, hospice in New Haven and a number of other situations in England originally, I think St. Christopher's or St. Elizabeth's, was a very beautiful plan to make it more humane and to make people able to die in settings that would be more emotionally supportive, where people would allow them to die the way they wanted to die, okay? In a much warmer, freer environment where they could decide with the doctor how much medication they could get. The doctor couldn't kill them, but the doctor didn't have to keep them alive if they didn't want to stay alive. And a lot of things that are happening in this society now, like these wills that are being made, living wills where people can decide that when they want to terminate care and stuff like that, that's all in that direction, okay? But what I'm interested in is something even farther out than that, if you will. That is, there are a certain segment of people like myself who see everything in life as a vehicle for awakening to God, including death. And I would like an environment that would be available to people who wish to use their death in order to awaken. In other words, treat death as an educational vehicle and not treat it as a big deal, but really that what they are is going to go on, and this is like a practicum workshop, right? And have them be around other people who understand this and who are themselves working on their own spiritual growth by being with people who are dying, okay? So that everybody is helping everybody else in the whole setting, okay? Such a game might start with just a dial-a-death, or, I mean, you know, a kind of a phone guide service, which we've thought of setting up, but it doesn't feel to me like there are enough of us that are conscious enough yet to do this. So what I've encouraged everybody to do thus far is to merely get experience being with people that are dying. It's what I do. I spend lots of time with dying people. And I grow incredibly through each person that I'm with. Incredibly. I went to visit a woman last week. She was somebody's aunt. She had asked to see me, and I went in to see her. She has 8 children. She's the secretary at the church. She's a wonderful, loving mother, really a groovy woman. Final stages of cancer. And I looked in her eyes, and I was looking in the eyes of a great wise woman. There was no fear. There was no clinging. She was all ready. She felt the presence of Christ. She was just ready to float, leave her body, and I just felt I had had the visit, the darshan, the audience of a great saint. You know, I came away feeling totally blessed by that visit.